When writing a story, there's 3 key points you need to consider: your story, your characters, and your world. This is the trifecta of crafting a narrative, and of the 3, world building is my weakest. I know other writers who get so excited about designing their setting that it consumes their every waking thought, and I am not one of those people. And honestly, I kinda wish I was. I'd love to be one of those writers with super expansive and interesting settings for their stories, but I usually get so distracted coming up with characters and situations for them that the world ends up gathering dust in the corner until the 11th hour. However, world building is still a really important part of crafting a story, and it's something that shouldn't be overlooked. So for those of us who struggle to come up with ideas for our story's setting, how do we make an interesting world for our characters and stories to exist in? Well, by building the world around them, obviously. So in this video, I'll be talking about my favorite method of world building, using characters and their stories as a base form and wrapping the setting around them. I honestly used to think this maybe wasn't the best method for world building, but hey, if it works, right? Plus, I found out recently that it's the same method Brandon Sanderson uses for his stories, and if nothing else, that makes me feel like a little bit less of a hack, so I'll take it. Additionally, I'll be designing 3 brand new characters in the background while we discuss and talking about them and how their stories have affected the world that I'm currently developing. But before we get to that, let's talk about how to make world building and character design easier and more organized with today's sponsor, Milanote. Milanote is a tool for organizing creative projects. When you're first starting a new creative endeavor, whether that's a comic, an illustration, a character design, or even a written book, organization is key to making sure you keep all your ducks in a row, and Milanote is a tool I love to have in my duck wrangling arsenal. I use it all the time for inspiration boards, and it's insanely handy for gathering and sorting out my ideas in a very visual way that I can constantly refer back to and reorganize as needed. If you're not sure where to start, Milanote has over 100 built-in templates you can use to suit your needs, or you can start with a blank slate and go crazy, which is what I usually prefer to do. When I was working on the designs for the characters in this video, as I dug through things like Pinterest and Google Images, I copy-pasted just about any image I found that was even close to what I was looking for, and after I had a huge pile of references, I started slowly whittling them down to just the ones I really liked and organizing them in a way that made sense to me. Some pictures I liked a very specific part of, but not necessarily the whole image, so I used the draw tool to circle the specific points I wanted to highlight, or added captions to note what specifically I liked about the image. I grabbed references for armor, clothes, color palettes, hairstyles, just about everything until I finally had a clearer idea of what direction I wanted to go in for the character designs, which helped save me a ton of time in the brainstorming and iterating process. As another handy thing, you can even use Milanote's Web Clipper browser extension to directly add just about anything directly to your Milanote boards with no annoying copy-pasting required. Plus, as I've been working on the early drafts of my upcoming novel, The Azure Mirage, I've been using Milanote to plot out the story flow for the split narrative and color-coding scenes as I outline. I've also been slowly gathering visual references for certain environments, locations, and scenes to help me figure out how I want to describe them and have better visuals I can refer to during the writing process. Additionally, if you're like me and like to work on the go or want to be able to jot down notes at a moment's notice, Milanote's mobile app is super handy and always available on your phone or tablet. Milanote is available for free with no time limit, so check out my link in the description to try it out for yourself. Now, before we get in too deep, I gotta drop a little bit of background info. I talked in a recent video about my upcoming novel, The Azure Mirage, a story following my character Lapis. However, that story is actually intended as part of a larger shared universe I'm planning called the Shattered Chord. My goal is to write a bunch of stories all set within the Shattered Chord universe. Lapis's story being one, another one featuring my character Verity, and any more that I eventually come up with. Lapis's story is still happening first. That one's still the priority. But thinking about other potential story ideas for the universe has been helping me flesh out the world more. See, part of the reason I'm doing the whole anthology of stories all set in the same universe thing is because I love interconnected stories, but another part is I don't enjoy world building that much and don't want to have to make a whole new fantasy universe for every new story idea I come up with. I'd prefer to have one world that I can continuously add to rather than starting the setting from scratch every time a new Blorbo enters my brain space. So, in the process of figuring out what kind of world I wanted to make, I started thinking about what types of characters I wanted to be able to include. Which brings us to one of my main goals for this project. Being able to throw whatever the hell I want into this world and have nobody question it. I want to be able to come up with whatever weird attributes to slap on a character and have it be perfectly plausible within the parameters I set up. I want to have characters with wings, tails, spikes and horns, weird halos, animal hybrids, whatever the hell type of humanoid character I feel like designing. I want to be able to shove it into the story and pretty easily be able to justify their existence. So there's a few different ways I could have gone about doing this, right? One was to just, throw logic out the window and say, if I want them to exist in this world, then they do. Simple, easy, no extra thought required. However, I do tend to favor a harder magic system, something with clearly defined rules and logic governing how the magic and the world works. Which kind of flies in the face of shrugging off a huge section of my world building. So my goal was to find a happy medium. Figure out a general origin story for how different fantasy species could exist, and make it flexible enough to account for any future additions or elaboration I come up with. Something that helped out a lot during this process of figuring things out was recycling. There's no law saying you can't rework world-building elements from past stories to save yourself some time and mental energy. The writing police aren't going to get you for not reinventing the wheel every time you make up a new universe. In my case, during the brainstorming process for Shattered Chord, I kept lingering on this pantheon of gods I made for a D&D game I ran for a few years. And while that pantheon didn't get a whole lot of focus in-game, I still liked a lot of the stuff I put forward there and thought it could be used as an interesting origin story for the different types of fantasy people and creatures in my new universe. So the story goes as follows. A very, very, very long time ago, there was a group of 10 gods that would later become known as the Ancestral Gods. 10 siblings who sought to create a new world. Each of the first 8 gods added something to the world they were making. For example, the first god created light, the sun, the stars, etc. The second god created stone to carve the general mass of the planet out. The third god created water, etc., on and on, you get the idea. However, when it was the 9th god's turn, he couldn't think of anything new to add that wasn't already made by his siblings, and decided rather than creating, he wanted to destroy it. This god's name was Vitor, and he did his very best to throw whatever disasters he could at the planet. Earthquakes, storms, droughts, floods, and just in general wreaked havoc. Following this, a war broke out that ended in the death of all 9 gods, the broken shards of their dead bodies raining down onto the planet they had just created. The final and youngest god was so upset after watching all this happen that he used his powers to try and revive his shattered siblings, but instead of bringing them back, ended up creating new life from the broken pieces. All the shards of the god of light became the first elves, all the shards of the god of earth became the first dwarves, etc. for all the gods, except Vitor because he's a dick. The final god became known as the god of cycles, life and death and rebirth, the flow of seasons, destruction giving way to new creation, etc. And with this origin story in mind, all I had to do was figure out the other 8 gods in the pantheon and what sort of fantasy people/creatures they'd be the origin for. Which has been harder than you'd think! I had a few pretty set in my brain before starting. I knew I wanted a god for elves, one for dwarves, one for some kind of tiefling replacement we'll get back to, but for the rest, I had to sit down and consider what other fantasy ancestries I'd want to include and what god or mix of gods they'd come from. This is something I'm still actively poking at, so I won't go into full details on every single one, but one of the ones I knew I wanted to have was a species of animal hybrids. Don't look at me like that. Don't look at me like that. I read Tokyo Mew Mew in 6th grade, and I have unironically loved cat girls ever since. Leave me alone. So here's a fun little fact about me. I love pretty much any type of big cat, but snow leopards are one of my favorites. I love their little faces, I love how floofy they are, and I love their pretty gray color. I love how their tails are super duper long and fluffy, and how sometimes they do a little tail chomp. Oh, they're so cute. So, a few months ago, I started brainstorming ideas for a snow leopard girl character. If you watched my sketchbook tour video, you've seen it. And eventually, those ideas congealed together to make Senna, the character I've been drawing in the background this whole time. I took some inspiration from the snow leopard characters in Arknights, as well as the actual body shape and patterns of snow leopards, and gave her ears, a tail, a shorter and more muscular physique, and shorter shaggy hair with areas of gray and black. I imagined her as being kind of a rough and tumble young adult, still in her moody, rebellious teen phase, but more like a grouchy and weary older teen. The beleaguered high school senior who's kind of moved on from the peak of their goth phase, but still wears a ton of eyeliner. The one that's so over high school, the type that hangs out behind the gym to talk shit with the other burned out seniors, you know the type. For her story, I don't have too much specific info right now, but I'm imagining her family all being traveling caravan guards, following the same trade route and going in a big, endless circle around the country and fighting monsters as they go. By that token, she'd have some combat knowledge, but less so than, say, a mercenary or a guardsman. She doesn't have any fancy equipment or armor, she gets by with a pretty simple staff and can whip out the claws in a pinch. For her clothes, I imagine that being part snow leopard, she'd be very accustomed to colder climates, but struggle to stay cool in warmer areas. So unless she's traveling through the mountains or another frigid locale, she keeps her clothes light and very breathable. Plus, considering her job requires a bit of combat, keeping things simple and unobtrusive I think was really important. Additionally, I really liked the idea of a bottom-heavy silhouette to give her a more solid and grounded appearance, so I gave her big, baggy pants combined with a pretty simple top. This may not end up being her final design, I'm still playing around with her story and personality, but I've been having a lot of fun brainstorming for her and figuring out what I eventually want to do with her. I have one idea I like, but put a pin in that for now and we'll come back to it later. But like I said at the beginning, one of my favorite and most reliable ways to world build is to figure out what kind of characters I want to stick in a universe and then reverse engineer the world to account for that information. I knew I wanted to be able to shove in cat girls and elves and whatever the hell else and worked backwards from there to figure out an origin story for them. You can also do this when figuring out something like a magic system. Figure out what you want your characters to be able to do and what limitations there would be, and use that as a base to establish the details of your magic system and other parts of your setting. Now, as for other ways to add to your universe, let's slide over to our next character, shall we? So, aside from what I mentioned before, another of my favorite ways to expand on a universe is to flesh out the other characters who exist in the background. Like, you have your main characters, right? Well, who are their parents? What are they like? What about their friends? Who did they grow up alongside and what are their stories? How did their situation differ from your main characters? Does your character have a mentor? Family friends? Neighbors? Extended family members? Political or work connections? What are they like? What's their deal? Etc., on and on forever. I'm not saying you have to fully flesh out every single person in your character's family tree, but sometimes spending a little bit of time diving into the people who surround your main characters can give you a lot of material to work with. As an example, so if you've seen my OC-tober video I posted last year, you're familiar with my character Verity and her story, but in case you haven't, here's a real quick rundown. Verity was a knight who traveled around adventuring with a group of friends, but not long into their travels, they got attacked by a monster and Verity died trying to protect the others. Her friends try to resurrect her, it doesn't work, they think she's gone for good, until about 200 years later she mysteriously pops back into existence, most of her old friends are dead, and it's all very tragic and hard for her to adapt to. In the process of poking at Verity's story, I started thinking about what her friends would have been up to in the 200 years she was dead. For example, her partner Rodin was so broken up about the whole thing that he never fully emotionally recovered from losing her, and did his best to keep her legacy alive, even adopting a daughter and giving her Verity's last name. A few hundred years pass, the adopted daughter starts a family. Rodin's a dwarf, so he's still alive, but he has a whole family lineage now, including his great-granddaughter Vesper teen noblesse Dawnborough II, Vesper for short. Vesper was originally going to be a minor character in the planned Verity novel. Rodin's great-granddaughter who grew up hearing all his stories about Verity and her adventures, who dreams of becoming a heroic knight just like her. Because how funny would it be for Verity to come back from the dead and find out she not only has fans, but that her biggest fan is her boyfriend's granddaughter? It's awkward for everyone involved. But when I talk about building a world around your characters, this is what I'm talking about. Once you start thinking about your characters and what connections you want them to have, you start realizing what the world needs to be like in order for those relationships to exist. One warning for anyone who wants to do this, though, is that, sometimes the additional characters you come up with will have big main character energy, and they will not be content as a side character in someone else's story. They're gonna want their own novel at some point, and, that is exactly what happened with Vesper. She busted into my brain like the Kool-Aid Man, and she will not leave. To the point that I'm now thinking of ways she could have her own novel eventually. Again, the Lapis novel is still happening first. But since the cast for the Lapis novel is pretty set at this point, having another outlet within the same universe to throw character ideas at has been really helpful, and figuring out stories for additional characters like Vesper has helped me figure out more things I want to include in the Shattered Chord universe. For example, if y'all have been watching my videos, you probably know by now that I love me some D&D. But part of making this fantasy universe has been wanting to take my existing D&D characters, shake the official D&D lore off them, and retool them for my own original fantasy world. And my favorite character ancestry in D&D is tieflings. Basically, little devil guys with horns and tails and such. Verity, Zephyr, Felix, Vesper, and many others were all originally conceived as tieflings. But the name Tiefling comes from D&D, and I didn't want to use devils or demons as the basis for them in this universe because those don't exist in the mythology that I've created. So, using the origin story we laid out earlier, I started thinking about how I could reverse engineer tieflings. Keep the same character design elements I love, but shaking the Christian devil origins off of them. I went back and forth with a lot of different ideas for how to approach this, and what I ended up settling on is that instead of being based around demons and devils and such, this universe's tieflings are all children of the god of change, a god who used his abilities to make the winds blow, create currents in the ocean, move the earth to create mountains and canyons, and cause fires to break things down and leave room for further creation. Basically, my tiefling replacements are elemental based. Fire, water, wind, ice, lightning, earth, etc. I haven't 100% settled on a name for this ancestry just yet, but right now I've been using Cinderins, with the god they come from being named Sind. It kinda sounds like cinder, which hints at fire, but it's different. I don't know, I might change it later, write that in pencil. Vesper and her entire family are Cinderins, just like Verity was. They get the horns and tails and colorful hair, skin, and eyes. And while in the modern day, not every person from a Cinderin bloodline has elemental abilities, Vesper actually has control over wind. And this ability ended up impacting her design pretty significantly, so let's talk about that for a second. Vesper is basically the pure distilled ideal of a princess knight. She's the daughter of a very important family, hence the princess part, but ever since she was a little kid, she's dreamed of being a knight just like Verity was. She wants to wear heavy armor and use a huge shield like Verity did, but given her wind-based abilities, it makes a lot more sense to keep her equipment on the lighter side. She can use the wind to make herself run faster, jump super high, slow her descent when she's falling, etc., and the more weight she adds with equipment and chainmail and armor, the less she'll be able to use those abilities to their full effect. So instead of a full decked-out armor set, she slims down and goes for a partial one. Breastplate and shoulder pauldrons, arm guards, and some cute petal-looking skirt plates. I always imagined her being pretty tiny. She's already young, but I'm thinking maybe she has a little bit of dwarvish in her family history as well, which leads to her being even shorter. So instead of a rapier like Verity, she might have better luck using a spear to give herself a bit more range. She's a little bit Chibiusa, a little bit Madoka, and a little bit Verity ground up in a mortar and pestle with a shit ton of glitter until it all congeals into a little pink unicorn baby. As for her personality, Vesper's whole thing is that she wants to be just like Verity when she grows up. Slaying monsters, protecting people, and being known all over as someone people can depend on. Even though Rodin and the rest of her family are all very protective of her. Vesper is the youngest of two. Her older sister is the one set to take over the family lineage when Rodin passes on, so Vesper, while still being part of the family, isn't really destined to inherit anything more than a family name. And sure, she could rest on those laurels and just enjoy an easy life, but that's not what she's about. She doesn't want to just be Vesper, the youngest child of an important family, no. She wants to be Vesper, reliable knight and hero of the land. She wants people to see her and recognize her talents. She wants to be taken seriously. She aspires to more than what life has handed her and is willing to do whatever it takes to chase down that dream. She is, to make a reference that some of y'all will understand, very Telemachus coded. If you know, you know. If you don't worry about it. Currently, my idea for a hypothetical Vesper storyline would be her butting heads with her family over wanting to go out and be an adventurer, but her family absolutely refusing to let her go beyond the protection of the city walls and learn combat for anything more than self-defense. But when she happens to meet a grouchy teen caravan guard, they form a fast sisterly friendship dynamic, with Senna teaching Vesper basic staff techniques behind her family's back whenever the caravan passes through town. Eventually, after learning fighting techniques from Senna for a while, there would be some kind of inciting incident that gets Vesper to run away and seek adventure, kicking off her hypothetical storyline. But that's all still very much in the air, no concrete info on that end just yet, maybe later. Out of all the characters I'm designing for this video, I've been having a ton of fun with Vesper specifically. Thinking about her hypothetical storyline and the way she might impact other stories has been a ton of fun, and I'm really excited to share more about her in the future. But for now, we've got one more character to discuss, so let's segue over to them. So, I mentioned D&D earlier, and while I adore every character I've created for that game system, one of my biggest beefs with D&D and games like it is... Okay, seriously, why is it that whenever you have half-elves, or half-dwarves, or half-orcs or whatever, the other half is always human? That's boring! Why are humans always used as the base? I refuse to believe that in the span of an entire universe of cool fantasy character types, we can't have, like, I don't know, characters who are half-elf, a quarter dwarf, and a quarter, I don't know, plant person. Let me mix things up. Let me get quirky with it. I want to make cool mixes of different character attributes, and that desire to dive into the results of mixing a lot of different fantasy lineages is what led to the creation of our next character. While I was brainstorming concepts for a hypothetical Vesper storyline, I thought it would be a lot of fun to add descendants of some of Verity's other friends into the mix. In that group, alongside Verity and Rodin, we also had Mira and Darius, a brash human weapons master and an uptight half-elf wizard. During the 200-year time gap while Verity was dead, the two of them ended up falling in love, getting married, and having kids. And considering the connections, I thought it would be really, really fun to have one of their descendants be another character in Vesper's potential storyline. So, meet Kemryn, great-great-grandchild of Mira and Darius. Kemryn was a character I sort of figured out the backstory for in the process of designing them. Their ancestor Darius was an incredibly famous and well-renowned mage who ended up inventing a lot of spells and magic devices that are still commonly used to this day, and he was also the founder of a prestigious magic academy. Kemryn, being his descendant, would have automatic admission to this academy, but was still able to get in by their own merit by submitting their application under a pseudonym. They're an extremely smart and talented mage with a bright future ahead of them, but at some point they end up taking a mental health tumble, dropping out of school, and becoming a bit of a hermit, which is how they are when Vesper meets them. I did a few basic sketches based on the really, really loose mental image I had for them, designed this cute, gloomy little nerd, and then thought to myself, hey, they'd look pretty cool with horns, wouldn't they? And then, oops, a ton of world building and character backstory just sprung forth from that one single concept. So, remember the Sindarin stuff we talked about earlier, my tiefling replacements? Well, I'm imagining that Sindarins probably start getting their horns when they're less than a year old. They aren't born with horns, but they start growing in relatively soon after birth. But, consider, what if a character only has a little bit of Sindarin in their bloodline? What would happen then? Oh, hi, Kemryn. Let's test that concept on you! Kemryn started at their family's magic academy with high hopes and a bright future ahead of them. They were smart, creative, studious, and while introverted, generally had a good reputation among their peers. But then, one day, at about 13 years old, these weird bumps start growing in on their forehead. They see a doctor, but their tests are largely inconclusive, and Kemryn decides to just start wearing a hat until they can figure out what's going on. And then, the bumps start to get bigger, longer, and sharp at the end, like horns. The tips of their fingers and toes start darkening, and they get shocked with static electricity way more than normal. Despite the fact that they grew up thinking they were mostly human with a little bit of elvish mixed in, a deep dive into their family tree reveals that they actually had a Sindarin great-grandmother, whose traits were nearly non-existent for 2 generations before slamming into Kemryn around the time they hit puberty. But since Sindarins usually get their horns super early in life, most people don't look at Kemryn and think, oh yeah, it's just their horns growing in, that's normal. A lot of their peers see the changes they're undergoing and end up starting rumors that they're cursed. And here's what makes it worse. Remember that evil god of chaos I mentioned a little bit ago? Well, he's still the antagonist in this world's pantheon. He's dead, and while he has no shard-born descendants like his siblings do, his negative effects on the world still linger. Natural disasters like earthquakes, floods, and thunderstorms are all affiliated with his influence, and anything related to them is considered a bad omen to the people of this world. And around the time that Kemryn's horns start growing in, they also begin to develop lightning-based elemental magic abilities, and it does not help with the curse rumors. While Kemryn started as an exemplary student, the constant stares and ridicule from their classmates ended up causing them mental breakdowns, and eventually they made the heartbreaking decision to drop out of the academy and return home. Broken and ashamed, feeling like their dreams of being a mage are now forever out of their reach, they end up isolating themselves to the point of becoming a recluse. They hate their electricity-based magic ability so much that they never properly learn to use it, and end up accidentally zapping people and things they come into contact with almost constantly. And they stay in this very, very low place for a while, until Vesper comes along. I have lots of ideas I want to play with in regards to the two of them and the potential future stories, but since it's all very up in the air right now, I'll go ahead and leave it there for the time being. As far as Kemryn's design is concerned, I had a pretty solid vibe I was going for, which really helped me figure out their design. I started with a gloomy little guy with downturned eyes and hair that hung in their face, very slightly pointed ears to hint at the little bit of Elvish in their family tree, and eventually added the horns and a few other design aspects once their backstory started coming together. I imagine that most of the time when they're just puttering around in their house, they'd wear baggy clothes and a big old poncho or something, but for their adventuring outfit specifically, I wanted to make it look like their parents bought them some nice mage robes for the occasion. Kemryn comes from a pretty rich family, so I wanted their clothes to be pretty nice to reflect that, while adding some kind of big cloak to act as a security blanket for them, as well as some little danglies they could potentially fidget with. But that brings us to the end for now. I'm still doing a lot of poking and prodding at this fantasy universe and these characters behind the scenes, and hopefully soon I'll have more info to share with you guys. For now, though, I hope you enjoyed my rambling, and hopefully this helped give you some ideas on how to approach your own writing, so get out there and make your universe come to life. Before we end, though, it's time for Star's Webcomic Corner, the part of the video where I talk about some of my favorite comics, boost my fellow creators, and give you guys something new and fun to read. So, let's get into it. There's magic in these streets. Dark spells, cursed artifacts, mages with a mind for murder, and more all linger in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to wreak havoc. While mundane citizens meander through their peaceful lives in unaware bliss, those in the Royal Secret Service tasked with protecting the people and unraveling the mystery set before them have been given quite a task. Though thankfully, they have a valuable asset on their side, an immortal mage with a sharp eye, a sharp mind, and, unfortunately, a sharp tongue. He's a bit of a dick who only plays by his own rules, but it's better to have him on their side than the enemy's, right? Hayden's Notes is a webcomic I only recently picked up and read all the way through, but I've been following the artist's work for several years now. The characters are all compelling in their own way, especially our main character Hayden, a mage with an interesting family history, made immortal by a bizarre magical accident who now works with the RSS to solve cases and unravel magic mysteries, as long as he gets something out of it anyway. This comic is one that definitely doesn't spoon-feed you. Traversing through the story and myriad cases tackled by the characters slowly but surely drip-feeds you information to let you slowly carve out the world and lore, and combined with the beautifully crafted art style, it's an intriguing ride from start to finish. If you're the type to love stories that make you curious, this one is definitely worth taking a peek at. Plus, with the story progressing as a series of short stories glimpsing into the lives of its characters, it's one you can pick up and read in small batches or binge all in one sitting. There's a lot to love here, and I highly recommend checking it out for yourself. If you'd like to read the comic, you can check it out on both Tapas and Webtoon. Links will be down in the description, so go check it out. And that'll be it for this one! Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you all enjoyed! If you like the art I did for this video, I'll have signed mini prints up in my store available for purchase. And additionally, if you like my work and want to get early videos, your name in my video credits, behind the scenes info on both the Shattered Chord world and my other stories, and more, check out my Patreon, link is down below. Additionally, thanks as always to my video shout out tier patrons: Jared, Holly, Mr. Don Matsu, Alyssa Herzog, Felix Frenzy, and Neon Valkyrie. Thanks for helping to keep the writer gears in my brain a-turnin'. That said, that's gonna be it for me. Fare thee well, friends, and I will see y'all next time. Bye!